God for all that was good and true in her life, and for the many, many precious memories which shall endure. And so now in this hour of grief, let us incline our ears to listen to the words of the psalmist, words which bring us the message of God's nearness. Esainai el harim me'ayin yavo Ezri, Ezri me'edam Adonai ose shamayim va'aretz. I will lift up mine eyes unto the mountains. From whence shall my help come? My help cometh from the Lord who made heaven and earth. He will not suffer thy foot to be moved. He that keepeth thee will not slumber. Behold, he that keepeth Israel doth neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord is thy keeper. The Lord is thy shade upon thy right hand. The sun shall not smite thee by day, nor the moon by night. The Lord shall keep thee from all evil. He shall keep thy soul. The Lord shall guard thy going out and thy coming in, from this time forth and forever. Mizmor LeDavid, Adonai roi lo echsar, v'noot deshi arbitzeni al mei menuchot yinahaleni nafshi shovev, yancheni b'magalei tzedek leman shemo. Gam ki elech begetz al mavet lo ira ra ki ata imadi, shivtecha umishantecha hema yanachamuni, ta'aroch lefanai shulchan neged zorai, tishanta v'shemen roshi kosi revaya. Ach tov v'chesed yudefuni kol yamei chayai, v'shavti beveit Adonai le'orech yamim. If you happen to have picked up one of these pamphlets, or if you know the 23rd Psalm in English, we could say it together. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil. My cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever.
In the book of Kohelet, or Ecclesiastes, we're taught that there is a time for every experience under heaven, that there is a time for silence and a time for speaking. Now is the time for speaking. I'll invite first Ben Siegel and Laura Perpignal forward to share some words about Marion, their granny.
Granny was always a very loving grandmother, strong, capable, and since our grandpa passed away, fiercely independent. She was someone who thankfully decided to stop driving on her own. None of us would have been able to convince her otherwise. I remember when she purchased her last car on her own as well. She was very proud. She decided what to get, did the negotiating herself, and terrified the salesman on the test drive when he realized she still drove with both feet. Our Granny could be the definition of chutzpah. The way that she would tell a restaurant host that we have a reservation often sounded like a threat that our table had better be ready. My grandfather stood about 6'2", 1 foot plus above my grandmother, and he always would say that she was the only person in his life that he was afraid of. Granny loved being a hostess and making sure that everyone was taken care of. When I was in Ann Arbor, I'd frequently make a 45-minute drive over to see her, always included her taking me out to dinner. Every year she would insist that we would go out for my birthday, and after dinner there was a massive cake back at her house that she would send me back to college with after having a small slice. I always tried to split it with her, and like I said before, you couldn't change Granny's mind. As our family grew, Granny embraced everyone. I remember when my dad and Andrea got married, we were taking the pre-wedding family photos, and Granny was clear that Brian and Daniel were her grandchildren now. As we found our spouses and grown our families, Granny enjoyed being able to celebrate with us, even if she frequently would give us a hard time over how long we were together before we were engaged or married. It's been lovely that we were able to spend so much time together as a family of 4 generations. Zichrona livracha.
Over the years, I knew several versions of Granny. As a young girl, I heard the stories of the tenacious child that stood up to Nazis in Berlin, that traveled by train as a 10-year-old by herself, unsure if she would ever see her family again, and then traveling again on her own across Europe during the war, befriending an Allied spy along the way to meet up with her parents and to make it safely to America. She never spoke about her childhood in Germany to my dad, but she was able to share when I asked. To my dad's surprise, when Avi and I first met, I told Granny that he was from South Africa. And she replied, "Oh, we have family there." Apparently, a cousin we had never heard of had made their way to South Africa and had her father's watch. Could we please find it? We looked, but we never did. As a child myself, she was the quieter grandparent. My grandfather was the larger-than-life figure. He was loud and fun and took over almost any room that he walked into. Granny was the physically smaller one and the one behind the scenes, the one planning, organizing, and hosting. Together, they loved to travel and would often bring us presents and coins from all over the world, many of which my kids still have today. They created beloved family traditions, regularly hosting Pesach Seders with fresh horseradish straight from their garden, and the annual Siegel apple cider making. I take great pride in being able to carry on these family traditions today. But maybe the version that I appreciated the most was when my grandfather died in 2005, I got to know Granny as her personality shone through more. I was an adult and could connect with her in a new way. 8 years ago, when she moved just 5 minutes away from me, it changed our relationship. Now I could visit her weekly, usually after my kids finished preschool, and we would go have lunch with her together. We would carpool to family events, and I could just spend quality time listening to her. The greatest blessing was seeing the relationship between her and my own children develop. Not many people have great-grandparents, let alone have a special relationship with them. Each week when I would visit, I would share pictures of the kids in our family. We'd talk about things that they were doing and videos of their activities. She adored her children, my dad, and his brother Jeff, her grandchildren and her great-grandchildren, more than anything else. Her whole body would lift when we would come and visit. I am so grateful for the time that we spent together and the relationship that we cultivated over the years, and I will miss our visits and our sharing our day-to-day experiences. Her memory will continue to be an abiding blessing in our lives.
Now, I'm sure Marion would have wanted me to introduce you this way, Dr. Mick Siegel.
It's hard to summarize a life of almost 95 years in a few words, but I'll do my best. Marion can be summed up as a survivor in every sense of the word. My mother was born in Berlin in 1929 to Hans and Irmgard Bamberger. As an only child of well-to-do parents, she was doted on and had a sense of entitlement probably helped her survive many challenges in her life. Her family considered themselves German first and then Jewish, having lived well in Germany for generations. Her father was a lawyer and served in the artillery during World War II, and her grandfather was a judge. She had mostly secular upbringing, but was put in the Jewish school after the Nuremberg laws went into effect. She had fond memories of growing up in Germany until the rise of Hitler. I have pictures of her first day of kindergarten, where she was given 3 cones of candy that were larger than she was to make her learning experience sweet. Clearly it made an impression on her, as she had a lifelong love of chocolate. My mom's survival skills were honed at a young age. At about 4 years of age, she survived mastoiditis, which is a complication of ear infections, as treated with antibiotics. But there were no antibiotics at that time. She was operated on by her uncle, who was an ENT, and the surgery had a mortality rate of a little over 50%. She beat the odds and set off to the country to recover and lived on a farm for a summer. As an adult, she survived breast cancer and aggressive skin cancer. Surprisingly, she only considered herself a cancer survivor, but not a Holocaust survivor, as she was not sent to the camps. She also survived the death of her parents, husband, and the hardest thing she ever did was survive the death of her son, Jeff. My mother was a young girl in Berlin when Kristallnacht occurred in November of 1938. To give an idea about her toughness, when the brown shirts were writing Juden on my grandfather's office, which was on the ground floor of their home, he came out with a broomstick, yelled at the brown shirts that they were desecrating private property, and ordered them to clean it up. They claimed they scrubbed it off. The next day, when my mother was walking to school, she and her maid passed a corner drugstore that was being looted. And she stood in the doorway and screamed at the rioters they were desecrating private property and should clean it up. Her maid Gaga scooped her up and took her home before she got into any more trouble. Within 6 weeks, her parents were able to get a visa for her to go to Sweden. They put her on a train by herself at the age of 10. She was passed from one family to another and ended up in a town called Falun, which is about 150 miles north of Stockholm. There, she learned to speak Swedish and ski to school. She missed her parents terribly and sent postcards back and forth. Within the year, they were able to reunite with her parents in London just in time for the Blitzes. In 1940, she and her parents came across in a convoy of ships. 2 of those ships in the convoy were sunk by German U-boats. Luckily, they made it, and they settled in Detroit. My mother adapted to life in Detroit very well. She graduated from Cass Tech High School as a biology major. Yes, back then they had majors in high school. She got an undergraduate degree from Wayne State University and did most of the work towards a master's at the University of Michigan. My mother was very social and was a member of a sorority in college. Many of her sorority sisters were some of her best friends throughout her life. During high school and college, she was known as Bambi, since her name was Bamberger. I remember growing up answering the phone. "Hello, honey, this is Lori Levin. Can I speak to Bambi?" At college, she met the love of her life, Jim Siegel, and they married after graduation. My father was a big guy. He claimed to be 6'2½", and my mother claimed to be 5'2½", but I think that's only in at least 3-inch heels. Jim was a gunner in the Army Air Corps and was rarely intimidated. However, he often said that the only thing he was ever scared of was my mother. They were married 53 years. After they were dating exclusively, my father was dropping my mother off in front of her house, and they were in the car necking, as my father liked to call it. My 5'6" grandfather came out to the car and dragged my parents into the house and asked my father, "What are your intentions, young man?" They were married on December 16th, 1951. They both worked as teachers, and my father was also a graduate student at the University of Michigan. He did all the classwork for a PhD in education while working full-time. My mother claims to have done all of the reading for him and wrote most of his papers and would summarize the work so he could pass the tests. In the summer of 1955, my parents bought a house in Oak Park, Michigan, and then got a puppy that my father brought home in the shirt pocket. He named the puppy Pudnik, or Putzi, which is short for a nudnik with a PhD. I arrived at the very end of 1955. My mother had an interesting sense of humor. My name is Michael Dennis Siegel. My brother's name was Jeffrey David Siegel. He was 3.5 years younger than me. When I graduated from medical school, I told my mother how ironic it was that I was MD Siegel, MD. My mother put her finger to her mouth and said, "Shh, don't tell Jeff," because Jeff wasn't a JD. That was my mother's Jewish mother joke, that she always had an MD and a JD for children. Without a doubt, my mother's favorite children were her 3 dogs, Putzi, Brandy, or Boo Boo as we called him, a poodle, and Oscar, a Shih Tzu, for which the name should be self-evident. All 3 dogs were family members that had the run of the house. All 3 dogs lived to be 15 years old, and they went everywhere. In the car, they even went on canoe trips. Marion was a very involved Jewish mother. She went to all of our school events. She was my room mother and on the PTA, and even protested against unqualified teachers in the principal's office. She must have attended thousands of baseball games, hundreds of swim meets, track meets, wrestling meets, basketball games for Jeff and myself. The only sport she didn't like was football. She always made my father sign the permission slips so we could play football. Both my brother and I got hurt playing football, so apparently my mother knew best. Family meals meant that the television was turned off and we talked about everything around the table: school, politics, whatever. We were a liberal Jewish family. My mother usually lit Shabbat candles, and we celebrated most of the Jewish holidays going to temple or with our large extended Siegel family. My brother and I had a classic Reformed Jewish education and attended Hebrew school and Sunday school and had the big bar mitzvah parties. We had separate formal parties for my parents' friends and family, and then separate casino nights in the basement for our friends. My father was big into camping, and so my mother, a true city girl, had to also go camping. I first went off to summer camp when I was at the age of 3, as my father was the camp director. My brother was literally born at camp. When my mother went into labor, there was a truck stuck in the gate of the only exit of the camp. The truck driver had to break down the fence, and my mother barely got to the hospital in time. My father made sure that a second exit to the camp was constructed shortly thereafter. Although my mother was an only child, she adapted to being part of a big family. My father was the youngest of 5 children and the only boy. I have lots of memories of us hosting family events. My mother was a very good hostess, but she was really difficult to be around prior to the events. My father and brother and I would try to help out as best we could, but we could never do enough to make her happy. So we started to hide whenever people were coming over to stay out of her way. We hosted Thanksgiving and Seder and, of course, cider making. My mother was not a very good cook, but she was famous for making pumpkin meringue pie for Thanksgiving. So much so that my cousin Dan would always make her make an extra pie just for him to take home afterwards. She was also famous for mushroom barley soup for our cider making parties. Our family has had a tradition of making fresh apple cider for decades, started by my father and his best friend, Harry Meisner. My father had a huge garden with about 70 fruit trees, which was where the apples for the cider originally came from. My mother continued the cider making after my father died, and we are now on our 4th generation of Siegel cider makers. Mom worked as a travel agent after I went off to school. This meant that my parents got to travel at very discounted rates. As a result, they traveled the world without me. They went on about 25 cruises. They cruised the Caribbean, the Mediterranean, the Baltic, the North Sea, down the Nile, to Israel, down the Amazon. I know this because I was given T-shirts from whichever stop they made. In her retirement, my mother was active in B'nai B'rith bowling leagues and loved participating in Socrates Cafe, a guided discussion group. She was a longtime member of Temple Emmanuel in Oak Park. Later, she was a member and usher at Temple Bethel prior to moving to Chicago about 8 years ago. Marion loved to watch her family grow over the years. My wife, Andrea, and Jeff's wife, Martha, were like daughters to her. She was a doting grandmother to Laura and Avi, Ben and Katie, Dan and Kaya, Emma, Brian and Domi, and Daniel and Ryan. She was especially proud of her great-grandchildren, Sammy, Eliana, and Joey. My mother always had lots of friends. She had a weekly mahjong game for decades. She always carried this little change purse with her mahjong winnings for her weekly games. When she moved to Chicago, I had to move about 75 pounds worth of coins for her. She also loved playing bridge and her book and movie groups. She had lifelong friends among her sorority sisters, especially Margaret Meisner, Harry's wife. Margaret and Marion were close friends for many years, and after they were each widowed, they did a wellness check by phone every morning at 9 a.m. One would call the other for the month, and then the next month the other had to make the call. They kept up those morning calls until my mother entered memory care about 4 years ago. Mom managed her transitions remarkably well. Once Margaret moved out of Detroit, my mother sold her house and moved to Chestnut Square in Glenview, where she soon became an active member of the community. She introduced and led Socrates Cafe there. She joined the senior center and was an ambassador for Chestnut Square. She enjoyed the exercise classes and other classes and loved to have meals with her many friends there. When Mom moved to Chicago, she needed to get an Illinois driver's license. It took her several attempts to pass the written test because she had a tough time learning the different colored signs. After failing the test for the second or third time, she asked the person giving the test why they don't include writing on the signs for the test. The testing agent told her you needed to know the shape of the signs in case it was snowing, you couldn't read the signs. My mother's response was, if it's snowing, I won't be driving. She ultimately passed the test. A few years later, she voluntarily sold her car. It meant that I never had to take her keys away from her. She decided to make that easy. 4 years ago, we decided to move Mom to Emerald Place, since she could not manage on her own anymore. She started to walk with a walker and quickly regained her strength and became an ambassador for Emerald Place. Whenever a new client was interested in moving in, they used to have them visit my mother's room to show off how lovely it was and how one could make it into a home even in a memory care unit. My mother loved word puzzles and would do them to keep her mind working. She also played a mean game of bingo at Emerald Place. That's the only place where I've seen where bingo is a contact sport. My mother always played at least 3 cards and rarely didn't come away a winner. Until recently, my mother was reading the newspaper every day. She wanted to know what was going on in the world and would give us her opinions on many topics, including the war in Israel and how much she hated Trump. She was hospitalized a few weeks ago and as a result lost the ability to walk and control her own life. After that, she decided it was time for a new way. She did it as quickly and as painlessly as possible. She went hospice for about a week. Marion was a true survivor despite all the obstacles that came her way. She was defined by her determination, smarts, kindness, and a love of family. And she left us with a beautiful legacy. I love you, Mom.
Marion Ruth Siegel, Aleha Shalom, was a woman of strength, a woman of determination. She was a strong-willed woman with an incredibly big and open heart. She was dependable, and she did not mince her words. As you've heard, growing up in Berlin, Marion was the only daughter of Adolf Hans Hugo Sigismund Bamberger and Irmgard Bamberger, née Axt. She was brought up in a well-to-do family, her father a respected lawyer and her grandfather a judge. They lived in a highly sophisticated neighborhood. In fact, she grew up in the very same neighborhood as Albert Einstein, which is one in the same neighborhood in which President Kennedy delivered his famous 1963 speech where he declared, "Ich bin ein Berliner." Though Marion had a complex identity as a German Jew, she remained proud of her roots and especially proud of her upbringing. So much so that in her All About Me bulletin board at Emerald Place, her hometown was listed not as Detroit, not even as Berlin, but as Germany. That was a tension that Marion lived with for all of her life. At once proud of her German heritage, Marion was also realistic about her past. She was adamant that she was not a survivor because she hadn't been in the camps. She inspired Mick to study abroad in Munster, and during that time, Marion did travel back to Germany to visit her son, but she could not bring herself to ever go back to Berlin. Like their dad, Laura and Avi and Ben and Katie each took pilgrimage trips of sorts to Germany and to Berlin. This pleased Marion, though when looking at pictures, she very matter-of-factly stated, "That's not what it looked like." You always knew where you stood with her. From a young age, as you've heard, Marion was instilled with a love of learning and a love of candy. As the story goes, you've heard about the 3 containers of candy that were given to her when she began school so that learning should always be sweet. That love of learning lasted throughout her life as she became an educator and helped Jim with his coursework as he worked towards earning his PhD. And that love of learning and knowledge was apparent in how Marion read the newspaper every day, caring deeply about the world and about her values. She knew right from wrong, and she was a vocal Democrat. During Marion's early grade school years, the world as Marion, her parents, and the generations of her family knew it began to collapse. Today, we can look to the Nuremberg laws, noting them as one of the starting points of what would come to be known as the Holocaust. For Marion, in real time, these laws were much more personal than that. Even in her advanced age, she could still recall how upsetting it was as a result of these laws that she had to abandon her lead role in a public school play as she was forced to switch to an all-Jewish school. Almost without missing a beat, after, as you've heard, her time first in Germany and then Sweden and the UK, and finally landing in Detroit, she attended Cass Tech High School, where she majored in biology. After high school, she enrolled at Wayne State University, where she joined a sorority and formed her lifelong friendships. Given her married name of Bamberger, these friends, as you know now, would call her Bambi. It was in college where she began dating fellow student Jim Siegel. In some obvious ways, Jim was the opposite of Marion. She was a petite woman claiming to be 5'2", though her family disputes that claim. Jim, Alav HaShalom, was a towering, larger-than-life man. Marion came from a secular Jewish family and was the only child, whereas Jim was the youngest of 5 children and came from a religious family. Though different in these superficial ways, Marion and Jim had a beautiful marriage, a beautiful family, and together built a really beautiful life. As the story goes, within months, Marion and Jim had gotten married, bought a house, gotten a dog, and welcomed Mick, their oldest son. Jim and Marion were ahead of their time in that theirs really was an egalitarian partnership. Jim, as you've heard now, would say that the only person he ever was afraid of was Marion. Unquestionably, the center of Marion's life were her two children, Mick and Jeff, alav hashalom. The family of four had an idyllic life in Detroit. Marion and Jim were both educators, and Marion supported Jim's work in camping, even though it really wasn't her cup of tea. Mick recalls long drives, always filled with silly camp songs by the hour. They were best friends with the Meisner family, a friendship that lasted throughout their lives. In fact, it was Jim and Harry Meisner who bought the famous cider and wine presses. And as you know, that tradition, that cider-making tradition, lives on today, each fall with Laura and Avi and Sammy and Eliana. In addition to the cider-making parties, Marion would host Thanksgiving, Pesach Seders, and other family get-togethers. She really was a people person, embracing her community, surrounded by friends, whether the Maj Women, the Socrates Cafe Group, the B'nai B'rith Bowling League, or Temple Emmanuel, and later Bethel in Michigan, and even at Emerald Place, making friends among the competitive bingo players. Marion loved to be around people. She relished attending sporting games and events to watch and support Mick and Jeff. And you've heard that she loved baseball, swim meets, and wrestling meets, only to be slightly less fond of football. On the sports field and far beyond, she was exceptionally proud of her boys. They were, without a doubt, the greatest loves of her life. As life went on, Marion and Jim relished being grandparents to Laura and Ben, Dan and Emma, Brian and Daniel. Later on, after they lost Jim, Marion's strength came through in a different way. And her grandchildren, their spouses, and her great-grandchildren appreciated getting to really know their granny all over again in this new chapter. And in this new chapter, Marion's strength and determination once again shone through. She was self-sufficient, so she decided when it was time to sell her home in Michigan, insisting on taking the train by herself to Glenview. Marion was proud. She wouldn't say that she was wrong, but she did over time grow and work on her relationships. Marion even died on her own terms, with dignity. I don't believe it to be a coincidence that Marion died during Hanukkah, a season where we celebrate and rejoice in the resolve of the Maccabees, a season where we as Jews are full of pride for the strength of our people at this season in ancient times, and proud of our own people today. Marion could easily have defined herself by her early years, by her experience as a Jew in pre-war Berlin, by the 10 months she spent apart from her parents in Sweden, and then as a new immigrant picking up her schooling here in America. Nobody would have second-guessed had she identified herself by those terms. Instead, though, Marion was defined on her own terms. She was defined by her strength, by her determination, by her incredibly big and open heart. Marion is already deeply missed by her loving family, and her memory is already an abiding blessing. So now we pray that Marion's soul be at rest, that she will forever be bound up with the eternal. I invite you now to please rise. El male rachamim, shochen bamromim, hamtze menucha nechona tachat kanfei hashchina, im kedoshim utehorim, kizohar harakia mazhirim, et nishmat Miriam Ruth bat Chaim Shmuel ve'Urmgard, shehalcha la'olama, ba'al harachamim yastireha, b'seter knafav la'olamim, v'yitzror b'yitzror hachaim et nishmata, Adonai hu nachalata, v'tanuach b'shalom al mishkava, v'nomar, Amen. God of abundant mercy, God most high, may the soul of our loved one, Marion Ruth Siegel, who has gone into eternity, find the gift of perfect peace in your embrace, together with the holy and pure, whose light shines like the radiance of heaven. Compassionate God, hold her close to you forever, so that her soul may be bound up in the bond of life eternal. May she find a home with you, and may she rest in peace. Together we say, Amen.
Ladies and gentlemen, there'll be a private family interment in Detroit on tomorrow. The family will be together at the Perpignan residence at 2551 Cobblewood Drive in Northbrook, Saturday from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m., Sunday from 5 p.m. to 8 p.m. There'll be a minion at 7 p.m. each evening. Messages of condolences may be sent to Mick, and the email is on the service folder. Memorial contributions to Temple Beth Israel or Yad Ezra would be appreciated. That information is also on the folder. And for those of you who are joining us online, all this information can be found on our website. At this time, I invite everyone to please rise and stand in place as the pallbearers come forward, which is the whole family, other than Mick, and to help escort Marion to the hearse. And then everyone is invited to the social hall. Please rise. Oh, you're risen.